years ago, my wife and I had the opportunity to visit a restricted access country, a police state, for lack of a better way of putting it. And it was a fascinating experience. We would go from one block to the next, and as we transferred between blocks, we had to go through security. They would take our passports, they would check us out, they put us through a metal detector and ask us what we were doing, and it was really intense. In fact, one time we went out onto the countryside. We wanted to go outside of the big city. And so we got in the van and we drove out, and we drove for a couple of hours. But what we learned is that every time we stopped, 15 minutes later, the secret police were behind us, asking everybody that we had visited who we were and what we had talked about. It was intense. It took us hours to drive 50 miles because we had to stop at every security checkpoint, get out of the vehicle so that they could search us, check our passports, run us through security. I talked with one of the individuals who works there on a permanent basis, and I asked him, how do you function in this environment? And he said at first it was really hard because he has to plan a half hour every morning to get through security to just go one block to go to work. And he has to plan a half hour after work to get through security to go one block back home from work. He gets to security, they take his passport, they go to their database, they start running his name, checking out who he is, and it's a long process. And he said at first it was really frustrating. He got really mad. Why am I wasting all of this time? And then it hit him. This was an opportunity to minister to people. So he started smiling as he approached the security station, struck up a conversation with the guards, and made this a habit. And lo and behold, after a couple of weeks, the guards started to look forward to see him. After all, it's going to be a good conversation today. And through this process, he was able to demonstrate the love of Jesus in the midst of significant depression. In the midst of people who were in conflict with him, he was able to respond well when conflict arose. We're going to look today at Genesis 26, 12 through 33. And what I want you to see there is the idea of a righteous response to conflict. How a righteous response to conflict resulted in blessing for Isaac. You see, Isaac first dealt with some conflict, but instead of responding wrongly, he trusted in God's assurance and subsequently received blessing. So let's turn in our Bibles to Genesis 26, and I want you to see first the conflict and Isaac's restraint. You see, Isaac showed restraint despite being treated wrongly. In the midst of conflict, Isaac showed restraint. So we'll start with verses 12 through 22, but I'll actually read verses 12 through 15 to start with. It says, Isaac planted crops in that land, and the same year reaped 100-fold, because the Lord blessed him. The man became rich, and his wealth continued to grow until he had become very wealthy. He had so many flocks and herds and servants that the Philistines envied him. So all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the time of his father Abraham, the Philistines stopped up, filling them with earth. We have this character Isaac who is on the scene. A descendant of Abraham, the son of Abraham, the one who had received the blessing, the inheritance from Abraham. And what we see is that Isaac was blessed greatly. It says that he reaped 100-fold. Even in today's standards, reaping 100-fold is a huge harvest. That's a big deal. God had really blessed Isaac. He became the envy of the land. It says that the Philistines envied him. He had been blessed so much that they were envious of him. But that envy resulted in being treated badly, conflict, oppression. Let's read verses 16 through 21. Then Abimelech said to Isaac, "Move away from us. You've become too powerful for us." So Isaac moved away from there and encamped in the valley of Gerar, where he settled. Isaac reopened the wells that had been dug in the time of his father Abraham, which the Philistines had stopped up after Abraham died, and he gave them the same names his father had given them. Isaac's servants dug in the valley and discovered a well of fresh water there. But the herders of Gerar quarreled with those of Isaac and said, "The water is ours." So he named the well Esek, because they disputed with him. Then they dug another well, but they quarreled over that one also. So he named it Sitnah. When I read my Bible, I have to admit I tend to just read over this and move on. You know, it's a bunch of names, and he dug a well, they stopped it. He dug a well, they stopped it. But what we see here is the significance of the oppression. Isaac can't get away from it. He shows up, digs a well, God blesses him, and they say, please move out of here, get away from us. He does it again. They oppress him, they fill in his wells. So he moves on. He does it again. They oppress him. After 3 times, I know my temper beat done. I know that I have responded poorly in situations like that. Our instincts, my instincts, probably your instincts, often tell us to retaliate when we're treated wrongly. They tell us, get what you deserve. Come back against it. Isaac, instead of retaliating, responds well. Let's look at verse 22. Verse 22 says, he moved on from there and dug another well. No one quarreled with him over it. He named it Rehoboth, saying, now the Lord has given us room, and we will flourish in the land. Isaac responded righteously. He said, okay, I'll move on. I'm trusting God. I'll move on. Contrary to his instincts, which probably were shouting, you're the powerful one. You've got all of the wealth. Fight back against this. Isaac responded righteously. He didn't violate his trust in God. Okay, you might be at this point saying, yeah, that's easy for Isaac. That's easy for you to say, but it's a lot harder to do it than to actually say it. Well, there's a reason Isaac was able to do it. Let's look at the assurance that God had given him. In verses 23 through 25, what you're going to see is assurance. God assured Isaac of his promises, and Isaac in turn responds with worship. God gave him assurance, so Isaac worshiped God. Let's read verses 23 through 25. From there he went up to Beersheba. That night the Lord appeared to him and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you and will increase the number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham. Isaac built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord. There he pitched his tent, and there his servants dug a well. God, first of all, provided assurance, some much needed assurance to Isaac. I want you to notice the form of this assurance, the way it came. It says, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. The assurance that God gave Isaac was the assurance that he had been with Abraham in the past. He would be with Isaac in the present. Just keep that in the back of your mind. We're going to come back to that. Isaac's response is a response of worship. And I think that's important. When God gives us assurance, we respond with worship. Isaac did. But I want you to think about that assurance that God had given to Abraham. That assurance to Isaac, that assurance that God had been with Abraham and he would be with Isaac. You might tell me, well, God hasn't assured me. He hasn't come to me and said, I'll be with you. But he has made promises to you. He's promised not to leave you. He's promised not to forsake you. He's promised to send the Comforter, and he's promised you eternal hope. God has given you assurance. Even in a situation that you might not see positive in, even if it is a frustrating coworker or an unfair sibling, maybe your spouse comes home upset, had a rough day at work, and they take it out on you, or you're dealing with conflict in your church. God has given you the assurance that he's with you, and we can count on that. But you might tell me, well, God has never come to me in a dream to tell me that he's given me that assurance. He doesn't need to. Remember, what was the assurance that he gave Isaac? He said, I am the God of your father Abraham. That was the key. And what we have with us in our Bibles is much more than just Abraham. We have the history of Abraham. We have the history of Isaac. We have Joseph, Daniel, David, the Apostle Paul. The God of Abraham, the God of the Apostle Paul, and everybody in between is the same God that gave us assurance. We have the promise of assurance. We need to worship God because of that. So at this point we ask, okay, how does this all fit together? What is the result of Isaac's actions? How does this pan out for Isaac? And the answer is blessing. God blessed, but not just material blessing. God worked through Isaac's wise actions and gave the result of peace, respect, and further material blessing. But through Isaac's wise actions, he was able to see peace and respect. So let's look at verses 26 through 33 and pay attention to the peace and the respect. Meanwhile, Abimelech had come to him from Gerar with Ahuzath, his personal advisor, and Phicol, the commander of the forces. Isaac asked them, "Why have you come to me, since you were hostile and sent me away?" They answered, "We saw clearly that the Lord was with you. So we said, there ought to be a sworn agreement between us and you. Let us make a treaty with you, that you will do us no harm, just as we did not harm you, but always treated you well and sent you away peacefully. And now you are blessed by the Lord." Isaac then made a feast for them, and they ate and drank. Early the next morning the men swore an oath to each other. Then Isaac sent them on their way, and they went away peacefully. That day Isaac's servants came and told him about the well that they had dug. They said, "We found water." He called it Sheba, and to this day the name of the town has been Beersheba. Isaac's wise actions gave him some real benefits. First of all, Abimelech shows up, and Isaac asks, I think, a very natural question. What are you doing here? You sent me away. And Abimelech's answer is an amazing answer. We've noticed that God is with you, that God is blessing you. We've taken notice of this. The result of others recognizing God working through Isaac, that's significant. It also results in peace. You see in verses 30 through 31 that Isaac makes a feast for them, and they swear an oath to each other. Isaac's decision not to engage in the conflict resulted in ultimate peace for him and his family. That's a strong result. And then in verse 32 through 33, we see that there was continued blessing. God continued to bless. This does not mean that every time you do this that you're going to receive blessing from God. That's not what I'm saying. But a righteous response provided the opportunity for God to really work in this situation. I'm reminded just the impact that our response can have on people. And I'm reminded of a negative example. We made up some bumper stickers, t-shirts, things like that for church. And we did give a warning a couple of weeks ago in the church service. We reminded everybody that, if you're wearing the shirt or you've got the bumper sticker on, just keep that in mind as you cut somebody off in traffic and, drive a little bit out of control. Just bear in mind who you're representing. As Christians, we need to make sure that we remember that we are representing God. We have a privilege of representing God. Isaac, in this case, represented God well. The people noticed it. He responded to conflict in such a way that God was recognized by people who didn't know God. That's really cool. In 1956, 5 men set out on the task of reaching the Auca Indians in Ecuador. Amongst them were Jim Elliot and Nate Saint. They took an airplane and they flew over the camp for a while. They sent gifts down through the airplane. Finally, they decided to land. The Auca people were known as a very violent tribe of headhunters, essentially. But they had made enough contact, they thought this is going to work out. On January 8, 1956, they landed their plane and met with the Auca people. And it did not work out. All 5 men on the plane were speared to death. The plane was destroyed. The people who had speared the men went back to their Auca village, burned it to the ground out of fear of retaliation. 2 years later, Elizabeth Elliot and Rachel Saint, the wife of Jim Elliot and sister of Nate Saint, went to the Auca people and ministered to them, showed them complete forgiveness. The result was the Auca people adopted peace, and many accepted Jesus as their Savior. Their righteous response to conflict, to oppression, to horrific actions resulted in the salvation of many. Our instincts are to defend ourselves. But we need to ask, do we need to respond righteously in particular situations? You may be faced with a situation in the next couple of days. Will you determine to respond righteously, whatever that means in that given